The Jesus described in the New Testament did, in fact, exist. With respect to Jesus, we have numerous independent accounts of his life in the sources lying behind the Gospels and the writings of Paul.
In this video, we're going to be finding out if Jesus actually existed, and there's proof for it. So make sure to watch till the end, and shout out to Today I Found Out. Let's get right into it.
Have many stories discussing various supposed humans and other beings that we dismissed as legend as a matter of course. Perhaps no source of such legendary figures is more robust than figures related to various religions, with basically no one today, for example, thinking that Hercules ever actually existed, despite the countless and sometimes rather detailed tales of his various adventures passed down through history. But while few, if anyone today, still worships the gods and demigods of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, there are still many centuries-old religions that have survived today, who have figures that, at least those who followed the religions take for granted, really did exist. This brings us to the subject of today. Did the founder of one of the most significant religions in human history, Jesus of Nazareth, actually exist? And if so, what do we definitively know about what he did or said? As the first question, yes, unequivocally, as Jesus was an incredibly popular name in the region around the time Jesus was said to have walked the earth, Jesus of Nazareth definitely existed. That's like saying, did John from New York exist? Yes, New York John exists. He's a nice guy, makes great pizza. But that's not very interesting. So, what about the Jesus of Nazareth? Well, while it might come as something of a surprise to some, for reasons we'll get into momentarily, historians, from atheist to agnostic to Jewish to Christian, pretty much all universally agree that the Jesus described in the New Testament did, in fact, exist, and even that it's extremely likely that, at minimum, a couple of key significant elements of his life as described in the New Testament also very likely did happen, which we'll get into at the tail end of this video.
So right there, guys, anyone who denies the existence of Jesus is just not very smart, to be honest. And we're going to get into all of these atheists or people all acknowledge that Jesus of Nazareth indeed did in fact exist, and there's proof for it. So let's get into it.
Assistant historian Dr. Byron McCain of the Atlantic University of Florida states, "I do not know, nor have I heard of, any trained historian or archaeologist who has doubts about his existence. That said, that's not to say there aren't many people out there who don't agree. For example, a 2015 poll in Britain surveying around 4,000 people found that a whopping 40% of them did not believe that Jesus ever existed." But going back to historians, Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Duke University, Dr. Eric Myers, concludes with Dr. McCain chiming in, "I don't know any mainstream scholar who doubts the historicity of Jesus. The details have been debated for centuries, but no one who is serious doubts that he's a historical figure. Those who deny the existence of Jesus are like the deniers of climate change." End quote. Holdouts to the idea that Jesus existed like to point out, however, that we don't have any hard archaeological evidence or writings from Jesus himself, or even surviving contemporary writings from when he supposedly lived corroborating his existence. This is correct. However, if that's the rubric being used to tell if some historic figure actually existed or not, we'd pretty much have to assert that almost nobody in history ever existed, including some extremely prominent figures absolutely no one, including many of these holdouts' questions, lived. As atheist New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman notes, the reality is that we don't have archaeological records for virtually anyone who lived in Jesus' time and place. Pertinent to the topic at hand, up until extremely recently in history, there was not much of any contemporary evidence whatsoever that Pontius Pilate existed, the Roman governor of Judea, most remembered today for having Jesus crucified. That all changed in 1961 when a quite literal hard piece of evidence was found. At the site of Caesarea Maritima, archaeologists discovered a stone totally and in all ways coincidentally called the Pilate Stone, dating back to the time Pilate and Jesus were doing their respective dances. For reference, Pilate was the prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD and may or may not have been a great dancer. While it is a damaged block without the complete text surviving on it, it definitely mentions Pilate being the prefect of Judea, with it generally thought filling in the missing parts. It states, "To divine Augusti Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. Also, I'm a kick-ass dancer." As to what that...
Yeah, that's so true. I went to Israel and we got to see this firsthand. That proves, in the fact that, the Bible is historical evidence for not just Jesus, but people during that time, which is so crazy and so cool to see, like, we are still finding so many archaeological digs and finds that prove the existence of Jesus and prove the existence of the Bible is actually factually true. Another piece of evidence for Jesus. Let's continue.
Took dance classes as a kid as part of his formal education, or something like that. On the rest of the stone was dedicating some sort of temple or other significant building. But before this and some surviving coins, the evidence of Pilate piloting was arguably less than the evidence for Jesus Jesusing. And important to again explicitly point out here, Pilate was quite literally one of the most important people in all of Jerusalem at the time and an extremely prominent Roman figure, while Jesus was just a random peasant Jew. Going back to Dr. Bart Ehrman, he sums up, with respect to Jesus, we have numerous independent accounts of his life in the sources lying behind the Gospels and the writings of Paul, some that originate in Jesus' native tongue, Aramaic, and that can be dated to within just a year or two of his life, before the religion moved to convert pagans in droves. Historical sources like that are pretty astounding for an ancient figure of any kind. So, putting aside holding the question of Jesus' existence to a higher standard than anyone else in history, what about when we apply the standards historians do generally ascribe to? What's the actual evidence there? While there is other more secular evidence that we'll get to in a bit, so stay tuned as there are some relative smoking guns here, the most obvious answer is, of course, the writings in the New Testament itself. Now, on the surface, you may discount this, as using the Bible to prove the Bible seems rather absurd. So why do most historians, including those of the secular variety, not take this view in this case? For starters, the sheer weight of archaeological evidence that backs up a number of things discussed in these works during the periods the works are discussing. This at least demonstrates they weren't just conjured up completely by significantly later authors. Beyond this, some have also suggested such suppositions as the criterion of embarrassment, positing that a group would not completely make up a story that would embarrass themselves. Thus, as historian Will Durant notes, despite the prejudices and theological preconceptions of the evangelists, they record many incidents that mere inventors would have concealed. The competition of the apostles for high places in the kingdom, their flight after Jesus' arrest, Peter's denial, the failure of Christ to work miracles in Galilee, the references of some auditors to his possible insanity, his early uncertainty as to his mission, his confessions of ignorance as to the future, his moments of bitterness, his despairing cry on the cross. And of course his death.
That is amazing right there. Who in the world would write things that make them look bad? Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and they wrote that in the Bible. And John was fighting who will be the greatest, and that's something that is not cool. I mean, they wrote about them running away from the Romans. They were scared. They had no idea what Jesus was doing. And the other fact is, I don't understand how people don't the Bible as historical evidence. They're like, find something outside of the Bible. Those are writings that were compiled over time that we put together. Those are actual just historical artifacts, just like any other thing. But people say, it's in the Bible. Whoa. Let's continue.
A common criminal, something that was a bit of a major scandal for early disciples after the fact. Going back to Dr. Ehrman, he states of this, the Messiah was supposed to overthrow the enemies. And so if you're going to make up a Messiah, you'd make up a powerful Messiah. You wouldn't make up somebody who was humiliated, tortured, and then killed by the enemies. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright also chimes in, it flew in the face of all Hellenistic wisdom. Part of the point of crucifixion was that it completely degraded the sufferer. It denied him any chance of a noble death, a considerable preoccupation among pagans. It also, in the normal run of things, denied him a proper burial as well, since the body would have been eaten by birds, rats, or other carrion, and any final remains dumped in a common pit, end quote. Moving swiftly on from such speculative hypotheses, of which there are many leveled against the New Testament works to try to ascertain veracity of elements in them, Paul the Apostle's surviving works, considered to have been written around 50 to 60 AD, only about 20 or 30 years after Jesus' accepted death, mention meeting various people who knew Jesus personally, including a brother of Jesus's named James, as well as a couple of Jesus' apostles, including Peter, who Paul was a guest of for a couple of weeks in Jerusalem, not long after Paul's conversion. Further, given these were written not long after Jesus' death and were accepted, it's apparent for this and many other reasons that nobody at the time questioned whether Jesus had existed, many of whom would have been alive when the alleged events occurred, with some of these events quite noteworthy in terms of stirring up trouble amongst Jewish and Roman higher-ups. On top of this, other evidence strongly suggests Christianity had already exploded in Judea and parts of the Roman Empire at the point Paul was writing. This is important because it would have taken some time for this relatively large spreading to occur, further significantly dwindling the couple of decades between when Jesus is referenced to have existed and when we know for sure a rather large group of people from the region believed he did. On this note, also important in all of this is nobody among the non-Christian Jews or Romans seems to have questioned Jesus existed either, even at this very early point when many alive should have been able to know definitively either way. And certainly, given all the trouble the Christians were causing the Jews and Romans at the time, the higher-ups here would have had quite the incentive to put forth any evidence that Jesus had not existed to shut up the Christians had he not. But that still all has some level of speculation tied to it, or is from a Christian source. So what about some sources that are, shall we say, slightly more independent? Do any such relatively contemporary sources exist? Well, if you've been following along so far and otherwise don't think historians are idiots, it turns out yes. Two of which are generally considered quite definitive, at least with regards to the question of whether Jesus existed. For starters, enter an individual generally considered the greatest of all Roman historians, Senator Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who was born a couple of decades after Jesus' death. Tacitus not only gives a direct reference to the particular Jesus in question, but interestingly, he also states that Jesus was crucified by Pilate. In his Annals, 115 AD, in chapter 44 of Book 15, he discusses Christians being targeted as a scapegoat by Nero, stating, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our protectors, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show, a circus, where he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed." End quote. Now, it should be noted here that some questions.
Even though this was after 150 AD, he still knew about Jesus, and he knew that Jesus died under the hands of Romans. He was crucified. That's so much proof for Jesus. It's amazing.
Simply repeating something the Christians themselves were saying with no backing source elsewise. After all, it had been at this point many decades since Jesus was apparently executed. However, this notion is generally dismissed given Tacitus's preeminence as a historian and track record of having evidence to back what he said so definitively in his works, even if in many cases such evidence is lost to us today. It's also noted that Tacitus's position as a senator gave him access to many official records, and perhaps most significantly of all, he was part of the Quindecimviri Sacris Fundanis, which, among other things, oversaw various foreign religious cults at the time in Rome. This suggests that Tacitus would have likely been extremely familiar with and had access to any records of Christianity that existed at that point. Thus, while the skepticism here isn't necessarily completely unwarranted, in combination with Tacitus's reputation and the other evidence at hand and how it all correlates, most historians accept this as a valid early independent source of Jesus' existence. And speaking of other evidence to add to the pile, we have a rather more ironclad reference in the writings of another of the most famous historians of the period, Flavius Josephus, a man born in Jerusalem almost to the year when Jesus is thought to have been crucified. Now, for those who haven't watched our video on the quite literal deadliest fart in history that resulted in the deaths of 10,000 people that Josephus documents thoroughly, a brief background is in order, as it's important as to why Josephus's taking for granted that Jesus existed is thought to be so significant. As Dr. Robert Van Voort notes, if any Jewish writer were ever in a position to know about the non-existence of Jesus, it would have been Josephus. His implicit affirmation of the existence of Jesus has been, and still is, the most significant obstacle for those who argue that the extra-biblical evidence is not probative on that point. Born in 37 AD to an extremely prominent and wealthy family in Jerusalem, Josephus' mother was a descendant of the Hasmonean dynasty, former rulers of the region, and his father was a Jewish priest. Josephus spent his formative years on the Jewish side of the Jewish-Roman conflict, ultimately the head of the Jewish forces in Galilee. However, in 67 AD, after a 6-week siege of Yodfat, Josephus' siding with the Jews came to an abrupt end. Well, exactly what happened is up for debate, given Josephus' own account is primarily what we have to work with. On the 47th day, the Romans took the town, and Josephus himself and a few dozen others took refuge in some caves. Rather than be captured, they decided it was better to die, but owing to suicide being a sin, they drew lots to see who should kill and commenced with the mutual slaughter. In the end, the final survivors came down to Josephus and one other man, who decided rather than kill one another, perhaps it would be better to surrender after all. Upon doing so, Josephus ingratiated himself to the head of the Roman forces, Vespasian, by prophesying that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. And so it was that rather than kill Josephus, Vespasian decided to take him as a slave. 2 years later, Josephus was freed when Vespasian became emperor, and he was granted Roman citizenship and more or less completely cast his lot in on the Roman side of things, including serving as an advisor and translator to Vespasian's son Tacitus during the 70 AD siege of Jerusalem. Of course, Josephus isn't really remembered today for any of these exploits, but rather for such things as his highly influential work, The Jewish War, which, among other things, is considered one of the best sources for information about this pivotal period of Jewish history that ultimately saw their temple destroyed and their people displaced and their lands confiscated for Roman use. It and his other notable work, Antiquities of the Jews, also functioned as significant works in the early days of Christianity, given its description of events surrounding the era that comprised the life of Jesus of Nazareth, including accounts of prominent biblical figures such as Herod the Great, John the Baptist, and Pontius Pilate. Noteworthy in his efforts in all of this was to give an account that was impartial, unlike so many others of the era. As Josephus noted, of covering the same events, they have a mind to demonstrate the greatness of the Romans, while they still diminish and lessen the actions of the Jews. While given his Jewish heritage, you might think he'd be inclined to colour things more in their favour instead. Josephus himself noted his goal was to be impartial and that he would not go to the other extreme and will prosecute the actions of both parties with accuracy. Something, for the most part, historians generally agree he ultimately did. In any event, Josephus mentions Jesus not just once, but twice in Antiquities, written about half a century after Jesus was executed. That said, the first mention, in Book 18, is generally thought to have been altered at some point in history in its details. However, most historians accept that the reference to Jesus here is still valid, just that extra details were added by some Christian scribe later and just universally copied from there. In this one it states, and on the screen the bits in brackets are the parts that were probably later added, quote, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared."
So there you have it. People like to say, oh, part about Jesus was added on later by Christians. Maybe a little bit, but there's evidence to show that Jesus actually was in those writings. So shout out to Today I Found Out. The full video is in the description. You can watch below. And guys, so I encourage you to go to Jesus. There's so much proof and evidence for Jesus. Do that today. Admit that you're a sinner. Believe that he died on the cross and rose again in 3 days so that you can be saved, and make him your Lord and Savior over your life. In the description below, you can fill out if you want to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. Do that today. Please comment down below your thoughts on this, whatever that may be. I would love to hear them. And subscribe. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I know we can do it with your help. So thank you for all your love and support. It means the world to me, and you might like these videos here. Peace.